The heavy bag swayed like a hypnotized cobra as Maya Chen's gloves connected with surgical precision. Each strike landed with the muted thud of controlled power, her breathing steady despite the sweat that traced lines down her focused face. In the dim corner of Iron Will Boxing Gym, she moved with a fluidity that seemed almost choreographed, yet carried an intensity that spoke of something deeper than casual fitness training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Coach Tommy Sullivan watched from across the gym with barely concealed irritation, his weathered face twisted into its familiar expression of disdain. 23 years of training fighters had given him strong opinions about who belonged in his world, and Maya Chen definitely didn't fit his narrow definition. Her college education, her quiet demeanor, and her refusal to engage in the trash-talking that he considered essential to the sport marked her as an outsider in his eyes. "Look at the college girl playing boxer," Tommy announced to the gathered fighters, his voice carrying across the gym like a referee's bell. "Probably learned those combinations from a YouTube tutorial. All technique, no heart. Too soft for the real thing." The laughter that followed his comment rippled through the gym like water through a broken dam. Phones appeared in calloused hands, capturing another installment of Tommy's daily entertainment at Maya's expense. She continued working the bag, her rhythm never faltering despite the tremor of controlled anger building in her shoulders. Her hands adjusted the worn leather gloves once, twice, 3 times, a subtle ritual that had become as natural as breathing. What Tommy and his loyal followers didn't know was that Maya's precision came from a place they couldn't imagine. Those combinations weren't learned from videos or textbooks. They were muscle memory carved into her bones through years of training that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with survival. Every movement carried the weight of a past she had worked desperately to leave behind, a history written in scars hidden beneath her long sleeves and quiet exterior. The gym itself told the story of working-class dreams and broken aspirations. Located in the heart of Chicago's South Side, Iron Will had been Tommy's domain for over 2 decades. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of local fighters who had made it to regional competitions, yellowed newspaper clippings celebrating victories that seemed enormous at the time, but now gathered dust like forgotten promises. The smell of leather, sweat, and liniment created an atmosphere that was equal parts inspirational and melancholy. Maya had found this place 6 months ago, drawn by its anonymity and Tommy's reputation for training serious fighters. What she hadn't anticipated was becoming the target of his particular brand of motivational cruelty. In Tommy's worldview, boxing was a blue-collar art form that required a specific type of toughness, a willingness to embrace violence that he believed came only from the streets. Maya's articulate speech, her college degree, and her middle-class background made her an easy target for his frustrations about the changing world around him. The morning routine started at 5:30, long before the gym officially opened. Maya's alarm clock pulled her from dreams she never quite remembered, but always left her checking the locks on her apartment door. She lived in a converted loft in Pilsen, sparse and functional, with furniture that looked temporary despite her 2-year lease. The walls held no personal photographs, no mementos from a past she had worked to erase. Only a small shelf of books about trauma recovery and a punching bag that hung from reinforced ceiling beams spoke to her true interests. Her coffee was strong enough to wake the dead while she reviewed case files on a laptop held together with electrical tape and determination. Maya worked as a social worker specializing in domestic violence cases, a job that utilized skills she preferred not to think about too deeply. The drive to Iron Will took her through neighborhoods where she could spot potential threats in her peripheral vision, though she told herself these were just the observational habits of someone who worked with vulnerable populations. First 2 Arrive meant first to notice changes in the gym's atmosphere. Maya walked through the space like a detective examining evidence, noting which equipment had been moved, which lockers showed signs of tampering, which corners held shadows that hadn't been there the day before. Her assessment went far beyond the casual awareness of a typical gym member. She cataloged details with the precision of someone whose life had once depended on such vigilance. Tommy's campaign against her had started subtly. A comment about her form here, a suggestion that she might be more comfortable at a fitness center there. But grief was a toxin that demanded release, and Maya had become his chosen receptacle. His son Danny haunted every interaction, though Tommy never spoke the name aloud. Danny's ghost lived in Tommy's rigid insistence that boxing required a specific type of background, in his visceral reaction to anyone who approached this sport from a place of education rather than desperation, in the way his hands clenched when he watched Maya train with obvious skill despite her unconventional path to his gym. Danny had been Tommy's pride, a promising middleweight who had combined natural talent with the hunger that came from growing up in neighborhoods where boxing offered one of the few legitimate paths to something better. The car accident that took Danny's life had also taken Tommy's faith in fairness, leaving him with a fortress of tradition built around his pain. Maya's competence represented everything Danny would never have the chance to become, and her presence was a daily reminder of futures that would never unfold. The escalation followed a pattern that Maya recognized from her professional life. Tommy began documenting her every mistake, photographing her technique, building what he believed was evidence of incompetence. He assigned her the worst training times, the most worn equipment, created situations designed for public humiliation that he orchestrated with calculated precision. But his most effective weapon was psychological. He began questioning her background, suggesting she had misrepresented her experience, that someone should investigate why Maya Chen was so reluctant to discuss her athletic history. The whispers followed her through the gym like smoke, seeping into every conversation, every training session, every assessment of her abilities. Other fighters began to treat her with the casual dismissal that comes from repeated exposure to authority's judgment. What Tommy didn't realize was that some backgrounds were built to withstand scrutiny, constructed with the meticulous care of people who understood that survival sometimes required reinvention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya's apartment told the story of someone who had learned to live without attachments. The furniture came from discount stores, chosen for function rather than sentiment. The kitchen contained exactly what was needed for basic nutrition, nothing more. But hidden in a closet behind winter coats that rarely saw Chicago's brutal weather was a gym bag containing items that didn't match her carefully constructed civilian identity. Hand wraps that showed wear patterns inconsistent with 6 months of training. Gloves that carried the particular scuff marks of professional use. Medical tape and anti-inflammatory medications in quantities that suggested familiarity with serious training regimens. The social work job had been carefully chosen for its flexibility and its camouflage. Maya genuinely cared about helping domestic violence survivors, but the position also provided legitimate reasons for the hypervigilance that she couldn't entirely suppress. Her colleagues appreciated her ability to read dangerous situations, to spot the warning signs that others missed, to connect with clients who had survived trauma that defied easy explanation. What they interpreted as exceptional professional instincts were actually survival skills honed in circumstances she could never discuss. Her caseload included women whose stories echoed with familiar themes of reinvention and careful anonymity. Sarah Rodriguez, who jumped at unexpected sounds and always positioned herself near exits. Jennifer Kim, whose fighting skills seemed inconsistent with her claimed background as an accountant. Maria Santos, whose knowledge of self-defense tactics went far beyond what any weekend workshop could provide. Maya recognized the signs because she lived with them daily, the constant awareness that safety was an illusion that could be shattered by a single moment of carelessness. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days helping others rebuild their lives while her own remained carefully compartmentalized. Each client session was a reminder of the thin line between victim and survivor, between running and standing to fight. Her professional training had taught her that healing required integration, bringing together the fragments of identity that trauma had scattered. But integration was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the past she was running from had resources and patience that civilian authorities couldn't match. Tommy's harassment intensified as spring turned to summer. Chicago's heat made the gym feel like a pressure cooker, and Maya's continued presence despite his constant criticism seemed to fuel his frustration. He began bringing in guest trainers, former professionals who could assess her technique with authority he felt his opinion lacked. Their evaluations were always the same, technically proficient, but lacking the killer instinct that separated real fighters from weekend warriors. The guest trainers weren't wrong, exactly. Maya did hold back, did restrain the full extent of her capabilities, did train with the careful control of someone who understood that violent skill was a tool that could easily become a weapon. Her form was textbook perfect because it had been drilled into her by instructors whose standards exceeded anything found in civilian gyms. Her combinations flowed with practiced efficiency because they had been tested in circumstances where imperfection meant more than losing points on a scorecard. But explaining any of this would require admitting that Maya Chen was a carefully constructed identity, that her real training had taken place in facilities that didn't exist on any public record, that her skills had been developed for purposes that had nothing to do with sport. So she endured Tommy's criticism, absorbed his casual cruelty, and continued to train with the disciplined focus of someone who understood that readiness was the price of safety. The other fighters at Iron Will represented the demographic Tommy considered authentic. Marcus Washington, a former gang member who had found boxing after a stint in juvenile detention. His story was one of redemption through violence channeled productively, exactly the narrative Tommy understood and respected. Lisa Murphy, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and trained at night, treating the gym as both escape and empowerment. Her toughness came from circumstances that had left her with no choice but to fight for everything she had. Then there was Carlos Mendez, Tommy's current star, a heavyweight whose professional record was built on raw power and an appetite for confrontation that extended beyond the ring. Carlos had picked up on Tommy's hostility toward Maya and amplified it with the casual cruelty of someone who had learned that dominance was respected while vulnerability was exploited. His comments about her background, her techniques, and her place in the gym created an atmosphere where harassment felt not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining the natural order. Maya's response to the increasingly hostile environment was to train harder, arrive earlier, leave later, and perfect techniques that she hoped she would never need to use at full capacity. Her bag work became a meditation on control, each strike calibrated to maintain her cover while building the conditioning that professional-level training required. Her footwork drills were exercises in precision that satisfied her muscle memory, while appearing to be the enthusiastic efforts of a dedicated amateur. The contradiction was exhausting. Every day required a performance that balanced competence with concealment, skill with safety, truth with necessity. She was an expert pretending to be a novice, a professional hiding among amateurs, a predator disguised as prey. The constant calculation of how much to reveal, how much to hold back, how much to endure before the cost of staying exceeded the risk of leaving, created a tension that followed her home each night. Her apartment became a sanctuary where the performance could finally end. Here, she could train without restraint, could practice combinations that would raise questions if performed at Iron Will, could maintain the conditioning that her real background required. The heavy bag in her living room bore the evidence of training sessions that went far beyond what any casual boxer would need. The wear patterns told stories of techniques that belonged in professional camps, not civilian gyms, but even in solitude, Maya couldn't entirely escape the performance. Neighbors might hear, landlords might investigate, casual acquaintances might notice inconsistencies between her claimed experience and her obvious capabilities. So even her private training sessions required careful modulation, enough to maintain her skills but not so much as to create evidence that could unravel her carefully constructed cover. The psychological toll was measured in sleepless nights and hypervigilance that no amount of civilian safety could entirely ease. Maya's dreams were filled with fragments of a past that her conscious mind worked to suppress. Training sessions in facilities that operated outside normal oversight. Instructors whose methods focused on efficiency rather than sport. Situations where hesitation meant more than disappointment, where mistakes carried consequences that couldn't be undone with better preparation next time. She woke each morning with the taste of adrenaline in her mouth and the knowledge that Tommy's harassment was the least of her potential problems. The social work job, the boxing gym, the apartment in Pilsen, all of it was temporary scaffolding around an identity that could be dismantled and rebuilt somewhere else if circumstances required. The question wasn't whether she would eventually have to run again, but whether she could maintain her cover long enough to make the running worthwhile. Tommy's latest escalation came in the form of a challenge that he framed as an opportunity. Iron Will was hosting its annual Smoker, an amateur event where local fighters could test their skills in front of an audience of friends, family, and potential sponsors. Tommy suggested that Maya participate, ostensibly to give her the chance to prove herself, but actually to provide a public forum for what he assumed would be her humiliation. The Smoker represented everything Maya had been trying to avoid. Public attention, documented evidence of her capabilities, the kind of visibility that could attract exactly the wrong kind of interest. But refusing would confirm Tommy's narrative about her softness, her unwillingness to test herself when the stakes were real. Accepting meant risking exposure, but also offered the possibility of ending Tommy's harassment through demonstration rather than explanation. Maya's acceptance surprised everyone, including herself. The decision came from a place of exhaustion rather than courage, a recognition that the current situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Tommy's harassment had created an environment that was becoming increasingly unstable, drawing attention from other gym members, creating exactly the kind of drama that her cover identity was designed to avoid. The opponent Tommy selected was Jennifer Walsh, a local favorite with an aggressive style and a record that suggested she took amateur competition seriously. Jennifer was everything Tommy considered authentic: working-class background, training, history that started in childhood, and an approach to boxing that prioritized heart over technique. She was also Carlos Mendez's training partner, which meant she had absorbed both his skills and his attitude toward Maya's place in the gym hierarchy. The announcement of the match created a buzz of anticipation that made Maya deeply uncomfortable. Phones came out to record Tommy's theatrical presentation of the matchup, complete with commentary about finally giving the college girl a chance to prove herself against real competition. The attention was exactly what Maya had been working to avoid, but withdrawal at this point would create more questions than participation. Training for the fight required a careful balance between preparation and concealment. Maya couldn't afford to look unprepared, but showing her full capabilities would raise questions about her background that she couldn't answer safely. Her sparring sessions became exercises in calculated mediocrity, demonstrating enough skill to be credible while holding back the techniques that would mark her as far more experienced than her story claimed. The other fighters watched her preparation with the anticipation usually reserved for watching a train wreck in slow motion. Tommy's commentary provided a constant soundtrack of skepticism and barely concealed satisfaction at the inevitable outcome. Carlos Mendez offered unsolicited advice delivered with the condescending tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. The atmosphere in the gym became charged with an energy that felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with athletic competition. Maya's professional life provided a welcome distraction from the increasingly tense situation at the gym. Her caseload had expanded to include several women whose situations reminded her of her own need for careful identity management. The parallels weren't exact, but the underlying theme of reinvention in the face of ongoing threat created a sense of kinship that she couldn't acknowledge directly. One client in particular, Jessica Torres, had recently relocated to Chicago under circumstances that required complete separation from her previous life. Jessica's story of domestic violence and witness protection resonated with themes Maya understood from personal experience, though she was careful to maintain professional boundaries that prevented too much identification with her client's situation. During their sessions, Jessica displayed a wariness that Maya recognized from her own daily experience. The constant checking of exits, the careful positioning near doors, the split-second assessments of everyone who entered their shared space. Jessica's survival instincts had been honed by different circumstances, but they operated with the same underlying logic that governed Maya's own behavior. The work with domestic violence survivors provided context for Maya's boxing training that felt more legitimate than the hobby narrative she used in Iron Will. Self-defense skills were not only appropriate, but necessary for someone in her profession. The physical conditioning, the awareness training, the ability to recognize and respond to threatening situations, all of it could be justified as professional development rather than personal maintenance of capabilities she hoped never to need. But the irony of helping others build new lives while maintaining her own carefully constructed fiction created a psychological tension that followed her home each night. Her clients were rebuilding their identities with support systems, legal protections, and professional guidance. Maya was maintaining hers through isolation, deception, and the constant calculation of risks that civilian life wasn't supposed to require. The weeks leading up to the smoker passed with agonizing slowness. Each training session at Iron Will became a performance that required increasing sophistication as Maya balanced the need to appear prepared against the danger of revealing too much capability. Tommy's criticism evolved from general dismissal to specific technical points that demonstrated his growing concern that Maya might actually acquit herself well enough to undermine his narrative. The attention from other gym members intensified as word of the match spread beyond Iron Will's immediate community. Local boxing enthusiasts began dropping by to get a look at the college girl who was supposedly about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between fitness boxing and real competition. Their presence added another layer of pressure to Maya's already complex performance requirements. Carlos Mendez's role in promoting the fight took on increasingly personal dimensions. His commentary about Maya's chances expanded from casual dismissal to detailed predictions about how quickly Jennifer would expose her weaknesses. The satisfaction in his voice when discussing the upcoming match suggested that Maya's humiliation had become important to his own sense of the gym's hierarchy. Maya's sleep patterns deteriorated as the fight approached. The careful control she maintained during waking hours gave way to dreams that mixed her current situation with fragments of her hidden past. Training sessions in sterile facilities, where instructors wore no names and students asked no questions. Situations where boxing skills were tools in larger conflicts that had nothing to do with sport. Memories of violence that felt both foreign and familiar, like scenes from a movie she had watched so many times that they felt like personal experience. The weight of maintaining her cover became physically exhausting. Every conversation required careful editing, every response measured against the possibility of revealing information that didn't fit her constructed background. The constant vigilance was similar to what she maintained for professional reasons, but the stakes felt higher because the threat was more personal. Her apartment became the only space where some of the performance could be relaxed, though even there she couldn't entirely abandon the caution that had become second nature. The heavy bag in her living room bore increasing evidence of training, sessions that went beyond what her public persona required. The combinations she practiced in solitude carried the fluidity of muscle memory trained for purposes that civilian gyms couldn't imagine. The final week before the smoker brought an intensity to iron will that reminded Maya of pre-deployment preparations from her hidden past. The energy was different, more focused, carrying an undercurrent of anticipation that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Tommy's behavior toward her shifted from dismissive harassment to something approaching concern, as if he was beginning to realize that his entertainment might not unfold exactly as he had scripted. Jennifer Walsh's preparation became a public spectacle that drew observers from across Chicago's amateur boxing community. Her sparring sessions were attended by coaches and fighters who wanted to assess the technical challenges she might face, against an opponent whose background remained mysteriously vague. The attention created pressure that worked in Maya's favor, since Jennifer's training became as much about performing for an audience as preparing for competition. The contrast between Jennifer's public preparation and Maya's careful privacy created its own form of psychological warfare. While Jennifer's every training session was documented and analyzed, Maya's capabilities remained largely unknown. The mystery itself became a factor in the building anticipation, with speculation ranging from confident predictions of Maya's quick defeat to more cautious assessments that acknowledged the unknown variables in her background. Maya's colleagues at the social work agency noticed the increased tension in her demeanor, though they attributed it to the general stress of their shared caseload rather than her personal situation. Her supervisor, Dr. Rachel Kim, made several offers of support that Maya deflected with professional courtesy and personal evasion. The concern was genuine and appreciated, but accepting help would require explanations that Maya couldn't provide without compromising the very safety that her current identity was designed to protect. The dichotomy between her professional competence and her apparent vulnerability at the gym created a cognitive dissonance that Maya found increasingly difficult to manage. At work, she was respected for her insights, her ability to read dangerous situations, and her effectiveness in helping clients navigate complex trauma. At Iron Will, she was dismissed as a dilettante whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. The psychological preparation for the fight required techniques that Maya hadn't used since her previous life ended. Visualization exercises that went beyond typical athletic preparation to include scenarios that civilian boxing shouldn't require. Mental rehearsals that balanced the need to win convincingly against the danger of revealing capabilities that would raise questions about her background. The preparation felt familiar in ways that reminded her why she had worked so hard to leave that world behind. Tommy's pre-fight instructions carried an undercurrent of genuine worry that surprised Maya. His criticism had been consistent and harsh, but as the smoker approached, his comments began to include actual technical advice rather than simple dismissal. The shift suggested that he was beginning to realize that Maya's humiliation might not be as certain as he had assumed, and that his reputation as a trainer was now connected to the outcome of a fight he had arranged for entertainment rather than competition. The night before the smoker, Maya sat in her apartment conducting a final assessment of the situation she had created for herself. The fight represented a crossroads that would determine whether her cover could be maintained, or whether she would need to disappear into another carefully constructed identity. The decision to participate had seemed necessary at the time, but now she faced the possibility that solving one problem had created several others that might prove more difficult to manage. Her reflection was interrupted by a sound that shouldn't have existed in her building at that hour. Footsteps in the hallway that stopped outside her door. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for someone to photograph the apartment number. The subtle sound of someone testing the door handle to determine whether it was locked. Maya's civilian life had just intersected with the professional past she had worked so desperately to escape. The tools she needed were within reach, hidden, in places that looked innocent, but provided quick access to capabilities that Maya Chen wasn't supposed to possess. The question wasn't whether she could handle whatever threat had found her address. The question was whether she could do so without destroying the identity that had kept her safe for 3 years of carefully constructed civilian life. Tomorrow's fight had just become the least of her problems. The morning of the smoker arrived with Chicago's typical summer humidity, turning Iron Will Boxing Gym into a sauna that amplified every emotion coursing through the assembled crowd. Maya arrived 3 hours early, her gym bag containing items that extended far beyond what any amateur fighter should need. The building felt different with the temporary lighting rigs and camera equipment that local sports bloggers had brought to document what they expected would be a mismatch of epic proportions. Tommy Sullivan moved to the gym with the nervous energy of someone who's carefully orchestrated. Entertainment was about to become very public. His usual confidence had given way to a restlessness that suggested he was beginning to understand that Maya's background contained gaps that his assumptions couldn't fill. The promotional materials he had distributed described the fight as a showcase for Jennifer Walsh, but the growing crowd suggested that Maya had become the more intriguing story. Jennifer Walsh arrived with an entourage that included Carlos Mendez and several other fighters from gyms across the South Side. Her warm-up routine was performed with the theatrical precision of someone who understood that half of boxing was psychological warfare conducted before the first punch was thrown. Every combination was executed with crisp authority, every movement designed to demonstrate the gulf between her authentic boxing credentials and Maya's mysterious amateur status. The crowd that gathered represented a cross-section of Chicago's boxing community that Maya found deeply unsettling. Local trainers, former professionals, sports journalists, and amateur fighters had come to witness what was being promoted as a reality check for a college-educated interloper. Their presence transformed what should have been a small gym smoker into something approaching a public spectacle. Maya's preparation took place in a corner of the gym that offered strategic advantages she hoped she wouldn't need. Clear sightlines to all exits, positioning that prevented anyone from approaching without being observed, access to equipment that could serve dual purposes if circumstances required creative improvisation. Her warm-up routine appeared standard, but incorporated elements that served functions beyond athletic preparation. Dr. Rachel Kim arrived unexpectedly, having heard about the fight through Maya's casual mention of boxing as a fitness activity. Her presence added another layer of complexity to Maya's already precarious situation. Rachel's background in trauma psychology made her particularly skilled at reading body language and detecting inconsistencies between claimed experience and observed behavior. Having her supervisor witness Maya's performance created risks that extended beyond the immediate athletic competition. The pre-fight medical examination was conducted by Dr. Angela Martinez, a retired Army medic whose presence at amateur boxing events was both professional courtesy and personal interest. Her examination of Maya was thorough but revealed subtle inconsistencies that a less experienced medical professional might have missed. The callous patterns on Maya's hands, the specific muscle development in her shoulders and core, the nearly invisible scars that suggested previous injuries, inconsistent with recreational boxing. Dr. Martinez's questions were casual but probing, designed to elicit information that would explain the discrepancies she had observed. Maya's responses were carefully crafted to deflect without arousing suspicion, but the interaction highlighted the dangers inherent in any situation that subjected her to professional scrutiny. The medical examination passed without incident, but Maya noticed Dr. Martinez making notes that extended beyond the standard pre-fight checklist. Tommy's final instructions to both fighters carried an undercurrent of anxiety that contrasted sharply with his usual bombastic confidence. His advice to Jennifer focused on technical execution and ring generalship, standard coaching for someone expected to dominate. His comments to Maya were more cautious, acknowledging for the first time that she might possess capabilities that his previous assessments had underestimated. The transformation of Iron Will into a temporary boxing venue created an atmosphere that reminded Maya of other competitions in other places, where the stakes had been measured in more than amateur rankings. The crowd noise, the bright lights, the sense of anticipation that preceded organized violence, all of it triggered memories that she had worked carefully to suppress. Her breathing exercises served multiple purposes, managing both pre-fight nerves and the psychological echoes of experiences that civilians couldn't imagine. Carlos Mendez assumed the role of Jennifer's corner man with an enthusiasm that revealed how personally invested he had become in Maya's expected defeat. His presence ringside guaranteed that every moment of the fight would be analyzed and critiqued through the lens of his particular animosity. Maya understood that losing to Jennifer would satisfy Carlos's need to see her humiliated, but winning convincingly might create a different set of problems that could prove more dangerous in the long term. The referee's instructions emphasized the amateur nature of the competition, but Maya detected subtle variations in his tone that suggested he had been briefed on the unusual circumstances surrounding the matchup. His emphasis on defensive responsibility and early stoppage indicated that someone had expressed concerns about the potential for serious injury. The concern was flattering but also troubling, since it suggested that rumors about her background had begun to circulate beyond Tommy's immediate circle. Jennifer's corner team included several experienced trainers, whose presence elevated the fight's significance beyond typical amateur competition. Their collective expertise represented decades of professional boxing knowledge, and their decision to support Jennifer suggested that Maya's mysterious background had attracted attention from serious members of Chicago's boxing community. The gathering felt less like casual entertainment and more like a formal evaluation of an unknown quantity. Maya's corner consisted of only Tommy, whose conflicted emotions were evident in his inability to provide coherent tactical advice. His usual confidence had been replaced by uncertainty about what he was about to witness. The isolation highlighted Maya's fundamental problem. She was preparing for a public test of abilities that she couldn't fully display without exposing the very background that her current identity was designed to conceal. The crowd's energy shifted as fight time approached, transitioning from casual anticipation to focused attention. Cell phone cameras proliferated as local boxing enthusiasts prepared to document what they expected would be either spectacular domination or surprising upset. The documentation represented exactly the kind of visibility that Maya had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. But withdrawal at this point would create more problems than participation. Dr. Rachel Kim positioned herself near the front of the crowd, her trained observation skills focused on Maya with an intensity that suggested professional rather than casual interest. As a trauma specialist, Rachel possessed expertise in reading the subtle signs that indicated when someone's background didn't match their claimed experience. Her presence represented a threat that Maya hadn't anticipated when she agreed to participate. In the smoker, the opening bell triggered a transformation in both fighters that revealed the gulf between their approaches to competition. Jennifer came forward with the aggressive confidence of someone who had been assured of victory, her combinations flowing with the practiced rhythm of extensive amateur experience. Maya's response was measured and defensive, revealing just enough capability to avoid immediate disaster while concealing the full extent of her skills. The first round unfolded with Jennifer pressing forward and Maya circling, creating angles and managing distance with footwork that suggested training beyond what any recreational boxer should possess. Maya's defensive skills were sophisticated. enough to frustrate Jennifer's offense without appearing dominant enough to raise questions about her background. The balancing act required constant calculation of how much to reveal versus how much to conceal. Tommy's between-rounds advice reflected his growing confusion about what he was witnessing. Maya's performance exceeded his expectations without reaching levels that would force him to completely reevaluate his assumptions about her capabilities. His instructions focused on basic tactical adjustments rather than technical corrections, suggesting that he was beginning to realize that Maya's preparation extended beyond anything he had provided. Jennifer's corner made more significant adjustments, recognizing that their initial game plan wasn't producing the expected results. Carlos Mendez's advice became increasingly agitated as he realized that Maya wasn't collapsing under pressure. As predicted, his instructions to Jennifer emphasized increased aggression and shorter combinations, tactical changes designed to overwhelm someone he still assumed was fighting above her natural level. The second round brought increased intensity from Jennifer and continued tactical discipline from Maya. The crowd began to murmur about Maya's surprising resilience, their initial expectations of quick defeat giving way to recognition that the fight might be more competitive than anticipated. The shift in crowd dynamics created pressure on Jennifer to produce the dominant performance that everyone had expected. Maya's conditioning became evident as the round progressed, her breathing remaining controlled while Jennifer began to show subtle signs of the increased effort required to pursue an elusive opponent. Maya's defensive work was textbook perfect, slipping punches with minimal movement and countering with precision strikes that accumulated damage without appearing dominant. The performance required extraordinary technical skill disguised as fortunate amateur competence. Dr. Martinez watched from her position near the medical station with increasing professional interest. Maya's movement patterns, her defensive reactions, and her tactical awareness all suggested training that extended far beyond recreational boxing. Her observations were documented in notes that would later raise questions about Maya's background within Chicago's amateur boxing community. The third round marked a turning point as Jennifer's frustration began to affect her technical execution. Her combinations became less precise and more desperate, opening opportunities that Maya exploited with counterattacks that demonstrated timing and accuracy inconsistent with her claimed amateur status. The crowd's energy shifted as they began to realize that they were witnessing something unexpected. Maya's offense remained carefully calibrated to appear lucky rather than skilled. Each effective strike followed by defensive movement that created the impression of someone fighting beyond her natural ability rather than someone concealing superior training. The performance required acting skills that complemented her boxing abilities, selling a narrative of determination overcoming inexperience rather than expertise disguised as amateurism. Tommy's growing excitement was evident in his increasingly animated between-rounds coaching, though his advice continued to focus on basic tactics rather than advanced techniques. His failure to provide sophisticated instruction highlighted the gap between Maya's apparent needs and her actual capabilities. The disconnect suggested to observant spectators that Maya's preparation had sources beyond what Tommy could provide. Carlos Mendez's frustration became vocal as he realized that Jennifer was failing to dominate as expected. His corner advice took on an edge that suggested personal investment in Maya's defeat rather than professional support for Jennifer's success. The emotional intensity of his coaching created pressure that began to affect Jennifer's performance, her punches becoming more wild and less accurate as she tried to force the decisive moment that everyone expected. The fourth round brought a shift in momentum that surprised everyone except Maya, who had been carefully managing her energy expenditure while Jennifer burned through hers in pursuit of early dominance. Maya's counterattacks became more frequent and accurate, targeting Jennifer with combinations that demonstrated technical sophistication beyond amateur level. The crowd's murmur grew louder as they began to question their initial assumptions about the fight's likely outcome. Jennifer's corner recognized the shift and made desperate tactical adjustments, instructing her to abandon technique in favor of aggressive brawling designed to test Maya's willingness to engage in close-quarters violence. The strategy represented a fundamental misunderstanding of Maya's background, assuming that someone with her educational credentials would be intimidated by physical confrontation rather than trained for it. Maya's response to Jennifer's increased aggression revealed glimpses of capabilities that made Dr. Martinez take detailed notes about movement patterns that suggested military or law enforcement training. Maya's ability to manage close quarters combat while maintaining defensive responsibility demonstrated experience that recreational boxing couldn't provide. Her performance was becoming increasingly difficult to explain through conventional amateur development. The crowd's energy reached a crescendo as Maya began to take control of the fight, her counterattacks finding their mark with increasing frequency and authority. Jennifer's early confidence had evaporated, replaced by the frustrated desperation of someone realizing that her assumptions about her opponent had been fundamentally incorrect. The fight was slipping away from her despite every advantage in training, experience, and preparation. Tommy's corner advice became incoherent as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. Maya's performance contradicted everything he believed about boxing development, amateur competition, and the relationship between background and capability. His worldview was crumbling in real time as Maya demonstrated skills that couldn't be explained by anything in his experience as a trainer. Dr. Rachel Kim's observations from her position in the crowd were becoming increasingly focused on Maya's behavioral patterns rather than her boxing technique. As a trauma specialist, Rachel recognized signs of hypervigilance and tactical awareness that suggested experiences beyond typical civilian background. Maya's constant monitoring of the crowd, her positioning relative to exits, and her overall demeanor indicated someone accustomed to managing threat assessment in complex environments. The fifth round opened with Jennifer making a desperate attempt to change the fight's trajectory through increased aggression and willingness to absorb punishment in exchange for opportunities to land decisive strikes. Her strategy was tactically sound but physically costly, requiring energy reserves that her previous 4 rounds of frustrated pursuit had already depleted. Maya's defensive skills allowed her to minimize damage, while Jennifer exhausted herself in pursuit of the knockout that would salvage her reputation. Maya's counterattacks in the 5th round carried increased authority, her combinations flowing with the precision of someone whose training had emphasized efficiency over flashiness. Each strike was placed with surgical accuracy, targeting areas that would accumulate damage without causing unnecessary injury. Her approach suggested familiarity with violence as a tool rather than entertainment, a perspective that civilian boxing rarely required. Carlos Mendez's corner instructions became increasingly frantic as he realized that Jennifer was losing a fight that should have been a showcase for her abilities. His advice focused on aggressive tactics that ignored Jennifer's declining physical condition and Maya's obvious tactical superiority. The desperation in his voice suggested that Maya's success represented more than athletic disappointment. It threatened his understanding of how boxing hierarchy should function. The crowd's reaction evolved from surprised murmurs to engaged appreciation as they witnessed a competitive fight rather than the mismatch they had expected. Local boxing enthusiasts began to speculate about Maya's background, her training history, and the sources of skills that couldn't be explained by recreational boxing or college athletics. The speculation represented exactly the kind of attention that Maya had hoped to avoid. Jennifer's conditioning betrayed her in the later stages of the 5th round, her punches losing snap and accuracy as fatigue compromised her technique. Maya's superior fitness became increasingly evident, her movement remaining crisp while Jennifer's footwork deteriorated. The contrast highlighted preparation differences that suggested Maya's training regimen extended far beyond what any amateur should require. Dr. Martinez's medical observations noted the disparity in conditioning and recovery between the two. Fighters, differences that indicated significantly different training backgrounds, despite similar claimed experience levels. Maya's heart rate and breathing patterns suggested cardiovascular conditioning consistent with professional athletic preparation, while her injury management indicated familiarity with physical trauma beyond recreational sports. Tommy's between rounds. Advice for the 6th round reflected his complete confusion about what he was witnessing. His instructions to Maya were perfunctory and generic, highlighting his inability to provide guidance to someone whose capabilities exceeded his understanding. The coach-in relationship had inverted, with Maya's performance educating Tommy rather than implementing his instruction. The 6th round brought Jennifer's last serious attempt to change the fight's outcome through sheer determination and willingness to absorb punishment. Her aggressive approach created opportunities for Maya to demonstrate defensive skills that were becoming increasingly difficult to attribute to amateur training. Maya's ability to slip punches, create angles, and counter with precision suggested instruction from sources that civilian gyms couldn't provide. Maya's offense in the 6th round remained carefully controlled, producing enough damage to clearly win rounds without inflicting injury that would require medical intervention. Her restraint suggested experience with situations where the consequences of excessive force extended beyond athletic competition. The discipline required to maintain such control under pressure indicated training that emphasized tactical rather than emotional responses to violence. The crowd's appreciation for Maya's performance grew as they witnessed technical boxing of a quality rarely seen at amateur events. Local trainers began to discuss her techniques, trying to identify the sources of instruction that could produce such sophisticated skills in someone with no apparent competitive history. Their speculation created exactly the kind of professional attention that Maya's cover identity was designed to avoid. Jennifer's corner recognized defeat and began focusing on damage limitation rather than victory pursuit. Carlos Mendez's instructions shifted from aggressive tactics to defensive survival, acknowledging that Jennifer could no longer compete effectively with Maya's superior skills and conditioning. The admission represented a fundamental reversal of pre-fight expectations and assumptions. Dr. Rachel Kim's observations had evolved from casual interest to professional concern as she recognized behavioral patterns in Maya that suggested traumatic background requiring therapeutic intervention. Her training in trauma psychology provided insights into Maya's hypervigilance and tactical awareness that extended beyond boxing competition into personal security measures. The recognition would later influence Rachel's approach to their professional relationship. The 7th round showcased Maya's complete tactical control of the fight, her combinations flowing with the effortless precision of superior training and preparation. Jennifer's resistance had become token, her punches lacking the power and accuracy needed to threaten someone with Maya's defensive capabilities. The fight had become a demonstration rather than a competition. Maya's restraint became even more evident as Jennifer's condition deteriorated, her strikes remaining precisely controlled despite opportunities to inflict more significant damage. Her approach suggested familiarity with situations where excessive force carried consequences beyond immediate tactical advantage. The discipline required to maintain such control indicated training in contexts where violence served strategic rather than emotional purposes. Tommy's coaching had become irrelevant as Maya demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything he could teach or even understand. His between-rounds advice consisted of generic encouragement rather than tactical instruction, highlighting the reversal of their relationship from instructor-student to observer-performer. His confusion was evident in his inability to provide guidance to someone whose skills exceeded his comprehension. The crowd's reaction had evolved from surprise to admiration as they witnessed boxing technique of professional quality in an amateur setting. Local sports journalists began to research Maya's background, seeking explanations for skills that couldn't be accounted for by recreational training or college athletics. Their interest represented the beginning of scrutiny that could threaten Maya's carefully constructed civilian identity. Carlos Mendez's frustration had reached levels that affected his ability to provide coherent corner instruction to Jennifer. His personal investment in Maya's defeat had blinded him to Jennifer's declining condition and Maya's obvious superiority. His coaching became counterproductive, encouraging tactics that exposed Jennifer to unnecessary punishment rather than protecting her from further damage. Dr. Martinez prepared for potential medical intervention as Jennifer's condition deteriorated. Though Maya's controlled approach minimized the risk of serious injury, her observations of both fighters' techniques and conditioning would later contribute to questions about Maya's background within Chicago's amateur boxing community. The medical documentation would become part of a paper trail that could compromise Maya's cover. The eighth and final round began with Jennifer making a last desperate attempt to salvage something from a fight that had destroyed her reputation and challenged her understanding of her own capabilities. Her aggression was born of frustration rather than tactical calculation, creating opportunities for Maya to demonstrate counter-attacking skills that belonged in professional competition rather than amateur smokers. Maya's performance in the final round balanced the need to win decisively against the danger of revealing capabilities that would attract unwanted attention. Her combinations remained precisely controlled, producing enough damage to ensure victory, without creating medical emergencies or highlight reel footage that might circulate beyond the immediate audience. The calculation required constant adjustment based on Jennifer's condition and the crowd's reaction. Tommy's corner work had devolved into simple encouragement as he recognized that Maya's capabilities exceeded anything he could contribute through instruction. His role had become ceremonial rather than functional, highlighting the gap between his assumptions about her background and the reality of her preparation. The experience would later force him to completely reevaluate his understanding of boxing development and training. Jennifer's final round effort was admirable but futile, her techniques compromised by fatigue, and her strategy undermined by Maya's superior skills and conditioning. Her corner prepared to stop the fight if her condition deteriorated further. Though Maya's restraint made intervention unlikely, the mismatch had become obvious to everyone except those whose personal investment prevented objective assessment. The crowd's appreciation reached peak intensity as Maya demonstrated combinations and defensive techniques that showcased training beyond amateur level. Local boxing enthusiasts began to speculate about potential professional background, training with high-level instructors, or competitive experience that her official record didn't reflect. The speculation represented exactly the kind of attention that Maya had hoped to avoid through careful performance management. Dr. Rachel Kim's observations had crystallized into professional concern about Maya's background and potential therapeutic needs. Her training in trauma psychology provided insights that extended beyond boxing technique into behavioral patterns that suggested experiences requiring clinical intervention. The recognition would influence her future interactions with Maya in their professional relationship. The final bell ended a fight that had exceeded everyone's expectations while raising questions that Maya would struggle to answer. Her victory was decisive but not overwhelming, achieved through superior technique and conditioning rather than dramatic knockout power. The performance had been carefully calibrated to win convincingly, without revealing the full extent of capabilities that could compromise her civilian identity. The immediate aftermath brought congratulations and questions that Maya deflected with practiced humility and vague attribution of her success to preparation and determination. The crowd's enthusiasm was gratifying but dangerous, creating exactly the kind of visibility that her cover story was designed to avoid. Local sports journalists approached with requests for interviews that she politely declined. Tommy's reaction combined pride in his fighter's unexpected success with confusion about capabilities he couldn't explain through conventional training progression. His post-fight comments to local reporters focused on Maya's dedication and work ethic rather than technical instruction, implicitly acknowledging that her skills exceeded anything he had provided. The admission would later contribute to speculation about her background. Jennifer's post-fight condition required medical attention that Dr. Martinez provided while observing Maya's surprisingly sophisticated understanding of injury assessment and treatment protocols. Maya's questions about Jennifer's condition demonstrated medical knowledge that extended beyond first aid training, adding another layer to the mystery surrounding her background. The interaction was noted in Dr. Martinez's post-event report. Carlos Mendez's reaction to Jennifer's defeat was barely controlled rage that focused on Maya's victory rather than Jennifer's effort. His post-fight comments suggested that Maya had somehow cheated or misrepresented her experience, accusations that reflected his inability to accept that his assumptions had been wrong. His hostility would later influence other fighters' attitudes toward Maya's continued presence at Iron Will. The crowd dispersed with animated discussions about Maya's unexpected performance and speculation about her background that would circulate through Chicago's amateur boxing community for weeks. Local trainers exchanged theories about her training history, competitive experience, and potential connections to professional boxing or military instruction. The speculation represented exactly the kind of attention that could compromise her carefully maintained cover. Dr. Rachel Kim approached Maya after the crowd thinned, her expression combining professional concern with personal curiosity about behavioral patterns she had observed during the fight. Her questions were carefully phrased to avoid direct confrontation while seeking information about experiences that might require therapeutic intervention. The conversation would mark the beginning of increased scrutiny in Maya's professional life. Maya's departure from Iron Will that night carried the weight of success that felt more like failure, victory that created more problems than it solved, and recognition that threatened the anonymity she had worked 3 years to maintain. The fight had achieved its immediate goal of ending Tommy's harassment, but the cost would be measured in visibility that could attract attention from sources far more dangerous than local boxing enthusiasts. The aftermath would bring consequences that extended far beyond amateur boxing rankings or gym politics. Maya's performance had created a documentary record of capabilities that didn't match her claimed background, raising questions that would require answers she couldn't provide without compromising the safety that her current identity was designed to protect. The victory had been Pyrrhic, solving immediate problems while creating larger ones that would prove more difficult to manage. As Maya drove through Chicago's empty streets toward her apartment, she conducted a mental inventory of options that ranged from doubling down on her current identity to beginning the process of reinvention that had brought her to the city 3 years earlier. The decision would depend on factors beyond her control: how much attention the fight attracted, how persistent the questions about her background became, and whether the visibility would reach sources that had been hunting her since her previous life ended. The night had been a success by every conventional measure, but Maya understood that conventional measures didn't apply to someone whose safety depended on anonymity and whose survival required constant vigilance against threats that civilian life wasn't supposed to include. The fight was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. The surveillance began 3 days after the smoker, subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed the pattern. Maya spotted the first watcher outside her apartment building. On Tuesday morning, a woman in business attire whose posture and positioning marked her as professionally trained. The second appeared at the coffee shop near her office, a man whose casual reading of a newspaper couldn't disguise his systematic observation of everyone entering and leaving the building. Maya's training had taught her to recognize the difference between coincidence and deliberate surveillance, and what she was seeing fell definitively into the latter category. The watchers rotated on a schedule that suggested institutional resources rather than amateur curiosity. Their technique was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by civilians, but obvious to someone whose survival had once depended on identifying such threats. The timing suggested a connection to her boxing performance, though Maya couldn't determine whether the surveillance originated from legitimate sources, investigating her background, or more dangerous entities that had finally located the identity she had worked so carefully to protect. The uncertainty created a tactical problem that required immediate attention while maintaining the facade of normal civilian life. Dr. Rachel Kim's behavior at the social services office had shifted in ways that confirmed Maya's growing concern about professional scrutiny. Rachel's questions about Maya's weekend activities, her physical conditioning, and her stress management techniques carried undertones that suggested therapeutic assessment rather than casual workplace conversation. As a trauma specialist, Rachel possessed expertise in recognizing patterns that indicated hidden experiences requiring clinical intervention. Maya's caseload provided ironic cover for the hypervigilance that her current situation required. Her clients included several women whose circumstances involved ongoing security concerns, making her constant awareness of exits, her systematic observation of new faces, and her careful route planning appear to be professional rather than personal. Precautions. The camouflage was effective but psychologically exhausting. The first direct approach came from Detective Lisa Park of the Chicago Police Department's Athletic Commission Liaison Office. Her visit to Maya's workplace was ostensibly routine follow-up on amateur boxing events, but her questions focused specifically on Maya's background, training history, and competitive experience. Detective Park's line of inquiry suggested that Maya's performance had attracted official attention that extended beyond casual interest. Maya's responses to Detective Park's questions required careful balance between cooperation and concealment. Too much evasion would appear suspicious and potentially trigger more intensive investigation. Too much information could expose inconsistencies in her constructed background that would unravel under professional scrutiny. Her answers focused on general fitness goals and recent training, while deflecting specific questions about competitive history or advanced instruction. Detective Park's follow-up questions revealed familiarity with boxing technique that extended beyond casual knowledge. Her observations about Maya's defensive skills, conditioning level, and tactical awareness suggested consultation with experts who had analyzed footage from the smoker. The depth of her inquiry indicated that Maya's performance had raised red flags within law enforcement circles that monitored amateur athletics for various reasons. The conversation concluded with Detective Park providing her contact information and encouraging Maya to reach out if she decided to pursue more serious competitive opportunities. The offer was presented as professional courtesy, but Maya recognized it as a mechanism for maintaining contact and monitoring her activities. The police interest represented a new dimension of scrutiny that could prove more problematic than civilian curiosity. Maya's apartment had become a fortress of careful preparation and constant vigilance. Her evening routine now included systematic security checks that went far beyond normal urban caution. Window coverings were adjusted to prevent external observation, while maintaining sight lines for monitoring approaches. Door locks were supplemented with portable security devices that would alert her to any unauthorized entry attempts. The heavy bag in her living room served dual purposes, providing both conditioning maintenance and stress relief for anxiety that had reached levels requiring active management. Her training sessions had evolved to include scenarios that went beyond athletic preparation into tactical readiness for situations that her current identity wasn't supposed to require. The preparation felt familiar in ways that reminded her why she had worked so hard to leave her previous life behind. Tommy Sullivan's attitude toward Maya had undergone a complete transformation that created its own set of problems. His newfound respect and enthusiasm for her abilities manifested in increased attention and promotional efforts that directly contradicted her need for anonymity. Tommy's prideful claims about discovering and developing Maya's talent attracted exactly the kind of visibility that her safety required avoiding. The other fighters at Iron Will had responded to Maya's victory with a mixture of grudging respect and suspicious curiosity that made her continued training there increasingly problematic. Their questions about her background, training methods, and competitive plans required constant deflection that was becoming more difficult to maintain. The social dynamics of the gym had shifted in ways that made her presence notable rather than invisible. Carlos Mendez's hostility had intensified rather than diminished following Jennifer's defeat. His animosity now focused on what he perceived as Maya's deception about her capabilities, his accusations of misrepresentation and unfair advantage reflected his inability to accept that his assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. His continued presence at Iron Will created an atmosphere of tension that made training there both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Jennifer Walsh's recovery from the fight had been complicated by concussion symptoms that required ongoing medical monitoring. Dr. Martinez's treatment protocols included detailed documentation of the injuries and their probable causes, creating a medical record that highlighted the disparity in skill levels between the two fighters. The documentation would contribute to questions about Maya's background within Chicago's amateur boxing community. The viral spread of fight footage through social media platforms had exceeded Maya's worst-case scenarios for exposure. Cell phone videos from multiple angles provided comprehensive documentation of her performance that would be analyzed by boxing enthusiasts, law enforcement officials, and potentially more dangerous entities with resources for facial recognition and background investigation. The digital footprint represented exactly the kind of permanent record that her safety required avoiding. Local sports media had picked up the story as a human interest piece about an unlikely amateur boxing success, their coverage focusing on the dramatic upset and Maya's mysterious background. Reporters had begun investigating her history, seeking information about training origins, competitive experience, and personal story that could provide context for her unexpected capabilities. Their inquiries created additional pressure on the carefully constructed fiction of her civilian identity. Maya's colleagues at the Social Services Agency had begun noticing behavioral changes that reflected the stress of maintaining her cover. Under increased scrutiny, her hypervigilance had become more pronounced, her responses to unexpected sounds more reactive, her positioning in meetings more tactical. Dr. Rachel Kim's observations were being supplemented by input from other staff members who recognized signs of someone experiencing significant stress. The decision to continue training at Iron Will despite the risks was based on practical considerations that outweighed safety concerns. Abandoning the gym immediately after her victory would attract more attention than maintaining a reduced presence while gradually transitioning away. The balancing act required careful management of visibility while preparing for the possibility that her current identity might need to be abandoned entirely. Maya's analysis of the surveillance teams had identified at least 3 distinct groups, with different operational signatures and objectives. The first appeared to be law enforcement or regulatory officials, conducting routine investigation into her background and capabilities. The second showed characteristics of private investigators working for entities that remained unidentified. The third displayed tradecraft that suggested government or military connections that could relate to her previous life. The most concerning surveillance came from the third group, whose operational methods indicated familiarity with her background and potential access to classified information about her real identity. Their positioning and timing suggested knowledge of her daily routines that extended beyond recent observation, indicating either extensive preparation or access to intelligence sources that civilian investigators shouldn't possess. Maya's emergency preparations had reached levels that required active implementation rather than passive maintenance. Her apartment contained go bags positioned for rapid departure under various scenarios, financial resources distributed across multiple accounts, and communication protocols for alerting contacts who could provide assistance in crisis situations. The preparations represented acknowledgement that her current life might end with little or no advance warning. The psychological toll of maintaining her cover under increased scrutiny was measured in sleep deprivation and hypervigilance that affected her professional performance. Maya's effectiveness with clients had begun to suffer as her own stress levels interfered with her ability to provide therapeutic support to trauma survivors. The irony of her situation was that her expertise in helping others manage crisis was being undermined by her inability to address her own precarious circumstances. Dr. Rachel Kim's direct approach came during what was supposed to be a routine supervision meeting, her questions shifting from professional development to personal welfare with a specificity that indicated careful preparation. Rachel's training in trauma psychology provided insights into Maya's behavioral patterns that extended beyond workplace observation into clinical assessment of someone displaying symptoms consistent with ongoing threat response. Maya's responses to Rachel's inquiries required unprecedented levels of deception within their professional relationship. Her explanations for increased stress attributed her condition to challenging caseloads and personal fitness goals rather than survival concerns that her supervisor couldn't safely be told about. The conversation highlighted the isolation that her cover identity required, preventing her from accessing support systems that civilian life normally provided. The breakthrough in surveillance detection came when Maya identified the same vehicle, appearing in multiple locations across a timeline that indicated coordinated tracking rather than coincidental encounters. The license plate analysis through resources available to social workers revealed rental information that traced to shell companies with connections to private security firms. The discovery confirmed that her boxing performance had attracted professional attention that extended beyond law enforcement curiosity. Maya's investigation into the surveillance teams revealed a complex web of interests that included legitimate regulatory oversight, private competitive analysis, and potentially hostile intelligence gathering. The legitimate investigations could be managed through careful cooperation and strategic misdirection. The private analysis represented commercial interest that could be redirected or discouraged. The hostile intelligence posed existential threats that might require abandoning her current identity entirely. The tactical assessment of her situation identified multiple variables that would determine whether her current identity could be salvaged or needed to be abandoned. The level of official investigation, the persistence of media attention, the effectiveness of her misdirection efforts, and the activities of the most concerning surveillance team would all influence her decision-making process over the coming weeks. Tommy's promotional efforts had attracted attention from amateur boxing organizations interested in Maya's competitive potential, their inquiries focusing on tournament eligibility and ranking considerations that would require extensive background verification. The organizational interest represented another source of scrutiny that could expose inconsistencies in her constructed history. Tommy's enthusiasm for her success had become a liability that required careful management. Carlos Mendez's investigation into Maya's background had evolved from personal animosity into systematic research that posed genuine threats to her cover identity. His connections within Chicago's boxing community provided access to information sources and analytical capabilities that could potentially uncover discrepancies in her claimed history. His motivation made him particularly dangerous because his efforts were driven by personal rather than professional considerations. The most immediate threat materialized when Dr. Martinez contacted Maya directly to discuss medical inconsistencies she had observed during the pre-fight examination and post-fight treatment. Her questions about injury history, conditioning methods, and medical knowledge demonstrated clinical expertise in identifying signs that didn't align with recreational boxing background. The medical scrutiny represented a new dimension of investigation that could prove more difficult to deflect than official inquiries. Maya's response to Dr. Martinez's contact required acknowledging some inconsistencies while maintaining plausible explanations that wouldn't trigger deeper investigation. Her story about previous athletic experience in other sports provided context for unusual conditioning levels, while attributing medical knowledge to first aid training required for her social work position. The explanations were credible, but created additional details that would need to be supported if scrutiny continued. The decision point arrived when Maya intercepted communications indicating that the most concerning surveillance team was preparing to transition from observation to direct contact. The intelligence suggested that her real identity had been confirmed and that approach protocols were being finalized for what would likely be an ultimatum rather than a negotiation. The timing indicated that her window for voluntary departure was closing rapidly. Maya's assessment of her options had narrowed to two primary alternatives: attempt to maintain her current identity through active countermeasures and strategic misdirection, or begin immediate preparation for identity abandonment and relocation. Both choices carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes, but the decision could not be delayed much longer without losing control over the timing and circumstances of her departure. The countermeasures option would require sophisticated deception efforts that could temporarily deflect investigation, while she worked to neutralize the most serious threats to her safety. Success would allow her to maintain the life she had built in Chicago, but failure could result in exposure that would make future relocation more difficult or impossible. The strategy would require resources and capabilities that might compromise her cover through their very implementation. The relocation option offered greater certainty of immediate safety, but would require abandoning the identity, relationships, and professional progress that she had built over 3 years of careful construction. The process would need to be implemented rapidly enough to prevent interception, while thoroughly enough to prevent tracking to her new location. The psychological cost of starting over again would be significant, but the alternative might be permanent compromise of her safety. Maya's final training session at Iron Will carried the weight of decisions that would determine whether she could continue the life she had built or would need to disappear into another carefully constructed identity. The gym felt different now, charged with attention and expectation that made her presence notable rather than anonymous. Every punch thrown carried the possibility of being her last in this place, with these people, in this identity. Tommy's farewell, though he didn't know it was one, reflected his genuine appreciation for what he believed Maya had brought to his gym and his life. His transformation from critic to supporter represented personal growth that she would never be able to acknowledge or celebrate. The relationship they had built would become another casualty of circumstances that civilian life wasn't supposed to include. The drive home from Iron Will that night took Maya through Chicago neighborhoods that had become familiar over 3 years of careful routine and gradual integration. The city had provided sanctuary when she needed it most, allowing her to build something approaching normal life while maintaining the vigilance that her background required. Leaving would mean abandoning not just a place but a version of herself that had found peace in work that mattered and relationships that felt genuine. As Maya entered her apartment for what might be the last time, she began the mental process of separating essential items from those that would need to be abandoned. The sorting required not just practical considerations about weight and utility, but emotional decisions about which elements of Maya Chen's life could be preserved and which would need to be sacrificed to ensure Patricia's survival. The woman who had entered Iron Will boxing gym 6 months ago as a target for harassment had been transformed by circumstances into someone whose very success threatened the anonymity that her safety required. The victory that should have marked the end of one problem had become the beginning of others that might prove impossible to solve without sacrificing everything she had worked to build. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could not be postponed and consequences that could not be avoided. Maya Chen's story was approaching its conclusion, But whether that ending would be transformation or termination remained to be determined by forces beyond her control and choices she was running out of time to make. The confrontation came at dawn, when Chicago's streets were empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional jogger. Maya had been expecting it for days, her surveillance detection skills identifying the pattern of approach that preceded direct contact. The team that emerged from unmarked vehicles outside her apartment building moved with military precision that confirmed her worst fears about who had finally found her. Agent Sarah Foster stepped forward as the team's spokesperson, her credentials identifying her as Defense Intelligence Agency rather than the local law enforcement Maya had been managing. The presence of federal intelligence officers meant that her real identity had been confirmed and that the careful fiction of Maya Chen was about to be permanently dissolved. Lieutenant Patricia Mitchell, Agent Foster said, using the name that Maya hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. We need to talk about your current situation and the options available for resolving it safely. Maya's response was measured, her hands visible and her posture non-threatening despite the tactical advantages her apartment building provided. I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Maya Chen, and I work as a social worker for the city of Chicago. Agent Foster's smile carried no warmth. Your boxing performance was analyzed by specialists who identified techniques consistent with advanced military combatives training. Facial recognition software confirmed your identity despite cosmetic alterations. Your cover was well constructed, but 3 years of digital footprints provide enough data points for definitive identification. The revelation that her identity had been compromised through technical analysis rather than human intelligence represented a fundamental shift in the threat landscape that Maya had been navigating. Government resources had evolved beyond what her original protection protocols had anticipated, making the kind of anonymity she had been maintaining increasingly difficult to sustain. The people who have been hunting you are closer than you think, Agent Foster continued. Carlos Mendez has connections that extend beyond amateur boxing. His investigation into your background was funded by entities with access to resources that civilian investigators shouldn't possess. His personal animosity made him an ideal unwitting asset for foreign intelligence services. Maya's mental reassessment of the situation crystallized around the realization that her harassment at Iron Will had been orchestrated by forces that understood her psychological profile and knew exactly how to manipulate her into the kind of public exposure that would facilitate identification. The boxing match hadn't been an unfortunate accident, but a carefully engineered trap that she had walked into despite her training and experience. What do you want? Maya asked, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone calculating tactical options while maintaining diplomatic engagement. Your expertise, Agent Foster replied. The intelligence community has evolved since your departure, but the threats you were trained to counter have evolved faster. We need someone with your background to help address problems that conventional approaches have failed to solve. The offer represented both opportunity and trap, a chance to return to meaningful work that aligned with her skills, while potentially exposing her to the same dangers that had forced her into hiding originally. Maya's decision would need to account for variables that extended beyond her personal safety, to include the welfare of people like Dr. Rachel Kim, Tommy Sullivan, and her clients who had become part of her civilian life. The alternative, Agent Foster said, reading Maya's hesitation accurately, is that we relocate you again, but the next identity will require more restrictions and less independence. The digital surveillance capabilities that identified you will only become more sophisticated, making long-term anonymity increasingly unlikely. Maya understood that the choice being presented was between voluntary cooperation and involuntary protection, both of which would end the life she had built as Maya Chen, but offered different levels of control over what came next. Her decision would determine not just her future, but the safety of everyone whose lives had intersected with her carefully constructed civilian identity. "I need guarantees about the people in my current life," Maya said. "My supervisor, the fighters at the gym, my clients. They didn't choose to be involved in this situation, and they shouldn't suffer consequences for my presence in their lives." Agent Foster's nod suggested that such concerns had been anticipated and could be addressed. Dr. Kim will be briefed on your actual background and the therapeutic support available for processing the revelations about your identity. Tommy Sullivan will receive an explanation that satisfies his curiosity without exposing classified details. Your clients will be transferred to other social workers with appropriate background briefings to ensure continuity of care. The thoroughness of the preparation suggested that Maya's reintegration into official channels had been planned for some time, waiting only for the right circumstances to make the approach. Her boxing performance had provided the leverage needed to make voluntary cooperation more attractive than continued flight. What about Carlos Mendez and the people who used him? Maya asked, her tactical mind already working through the implications of his unwitting collaboration with hostile intelligence services. That situation is being addressed through separate channels, Agent Foster replied. His usefulness as an intelligence asset ended when you were identified. The foreign operatives who recruited him are being tracked, and his role in exposing you will be explained in ways that don't compromise his safety, while ending his effectiveness as a future intelligence target. Maya's acceptance of the offer came with conditions that reflected her hard-won understanding of how government promises could be interpreted and implemented. Her cooperation would be voluntary and could be withdrawn if the work exceeded the parameters they established. Her new identity would include genuine autonomy rather than supervised protection. The people in her civilian life would receive support that prioritized their welfare over operational security. The transition began immediately, with Agent Foster's team providing security while Maya conducted final business as Maya Chen. Her resignation from the Social Services Agency was explained as a family emergency requiring immediate relocation, allowing Dr. Rachel Kim to understand that their professional relationship was ending without creating questions that couldn't be answered safely. Tommy Sullivan's reaction to Maya's departure reflected the genuine affection that had developed, despite their difficult beginning. His questions about her future were answered with vague references to opportunities that would take her away from Chicago, explanations that satisfied his curiosity while preserving the fiction that Maya Chen had been a real person rather than a carefully constructed cover identity. The final visit to Iron Will carried emotional weight that Maya hadn't anticipated when she first entered the gym 6 months earlier. The relationship she had built, the progress she had made, and the sense of belonging she had discovered would all become part of a past that officially never existed. The sacrifice was necessary for safety, but the cost was measured in connections that had made her feel human again. Carlos Mendez's arrest occurred simultaneously with Maya's departure, the timing designed to prevent him from connecting her disappearance with the investigation into his activities. His cooperation with foreign intelligence services had been documented thoroughly enough to ensure conviction while protecting the sources and methods that had identified his role in compromising Maya's identity. The new identity that replaced Maya Chen was constructed with the benefit of lessons learned from 3 years of civilian life and the enhanced security protocols that modern threats required. Patricia Walsh would have legitimate credentials, verifiable background, and official support that made detection and compromise significantly more difficult. Her new assignment involved training the next generation of specialists in techniques that she had developed through hard experience and continued innovation. The work would utilize her expertise in environments where her capabilities were assets rather than liabilities, where excellence was expected rather than concealed. The program she would lead represented an evolution in how the intelligence community approached training for complex threat environments. Her civilian experience had provided insights into psychological preparation and identity maintenance that complemented her technical expertise in ways that improved overall effectiveness. Dr. Rachel Kim's debriefing included therapeutic support for processing the revelation that her colleague had been living under deep cover while providing legitimate and valuable service to trauma survivors. The explanation helped her understand Maya's behavioral patterns, while providing context for the hypervigilance and tactical awareness that had seemed inconsistent with civilian background. Tommy Sullivan's gym received an anonymous donation that funded equipment upgrades and program expansion, recognition of his role in providing sanctuary when Maya needed it most. His transformation from critic to supporter had been genuine, representing the kind of human connection that made her civilian experience meaningful despite its temporary nature. Jennifer Walsh's medical treatment was supplemented with additional resources that ensured full recovery from her injuries, while providing support for processing the revelation that her opponent had been a highly trained professional rather than the recreational boxer she appeared to be. The explanation helped her understand that her defeat reflected skill disparity rather than personal inadequacy. Maya's clients were transferred to social workers who had been briefed on their cases and provided with resources that ensured continuity of care during the transition. The work she had done with domestic violence survivors would continue under supervision that prioritized their welfare while maintaining the progress they had achieved through her intervention. The foreign intelligence network that had used Carlos Mendez to identify Maya was systematically dismantled through operations that protected his safety while ensuring that their methods could not be used against other deep cover personnel. The investigation revealed sophisticated techniques for identifying and compromising protected identities that required immediate countermeasures. 6 months later, Patricia Walsh stood before a classroom of intelligence officers learning advanced threat assessment and identity maintenance techniques. Her transformation from hidden civilian to visible instructor represented a personal evolution that had been forced by circumstances but ultimately provided greater satisfaction than the careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years. The students she trained would face threats that required both technical expertise and psychological resilience, capabilities that she could teach through experience rather than theory. Her civilian interlude had provided insights into normal life that enhanced her ability to prepare others for the challenges of maintaining cover identities in increasingly sophisticated surveillance environments. Tommy Sullivan occasionally mentioned Maya Chen to new gym members, describing her as a dedicated amateur who had moved away for family reasons after achieving unexpected success in local competition. His story preserved her memory while protecting the truth about her identity and the circumstances of her departure. Dr. Rachel Kim integrated the lessons learned from Maya's case into her work with other trauma survivors, using the experience to better recognize signs of hidden backgrounds and complex identity management needs. Her enhanced awareness helped her provide more effective support to clients whose circumstances required careful therapeutic approaches. Iron Will Boxing Gym continued to serve Chicago's South Side community, its atmosphere slightly changed by the memory of a quiet woman who had proven that assumptions about capability and background could be dangerously wrong. The story of Maya Chen's unexpected victory became part of the gym's folklore, inspiring other underestimated fighters to persist despite initial dismissal. Patricia Walsh's new life represented a synthesis of her professional expertise and personal growth, allowing her to serve effectively while maintaining connections to the human experiences that had made her civilian time meaningful. The work was dangerous and demanding, but it provided purpose that justified the sacrifices required for her safety and effectiveness. The program she developed would train hundreds of specialists over the coming years, each benefiting from techniques and insights that she had gained through experience in both official and civilian environments. Her contribution would be measured in lives saved and operations succeeded, outcomes that vindicated the decision to bring her back into official service. Maya Chen had been a fiction, but the relationships and experiences she represented had been real. Patricia Walsh carried those memories forward into a future that honored both her duty to national security and her understanding of what made that security worth protecting. The woman who had been called too soft had proven that strength took many forms, and that the most effective warriors were often those who understood what they were fighting to preserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.